200 ships, that's impossible.
Those aren't warships, Your Majesty. They're mining carriers.
When 200 human super...
Dust fell from the vaulted ceilings of the Imperial Hall. For 3,000 years, the sky belonged to the Empress. Then, the gravity dampeners whined, sputtered, and died. A shadow swallowed the capital not from clouds, but from 200 slabs of human iron abruptly blocking out the sun. Empress Victoria hated the ceremonial collar. It was a heavy, rigid ring of spun platinum that dug into her collarbones every time she drew a deep breath. Today, she found herself breathing heavily. The throne room was uncomfortably cold. The environmental scrubbers, ancient and failing to keep up with the demands of the sprawling palatial estate, were pumping out air that smelled faintly of burnt copper and old dust. She ran a thumb over the armrest of her seat. The velvet was worn down to the thread in patches, a testament to the centuries her dynasty had ruled this system. It was supposed to project endurance. Right now, it just felt tired. "Say it again," she commanded. Her voice was flat, devoid of the regal echo she usually projected. She didn't have the energy for theater. Thomas stood at the base of the dais. He was an older man, his military uniform immaculately pressed but hanging slightly loose on his frame, as if he had shrunk in the last 48 hours. He smelled of stale smoke and sour sweat, an odor that cut straight through the heavy incense burning in the copper braziers lining the hall. "The deep space buoys on the outer perimeter, Your Grace," Thomas said. He swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. "They've stopped transmitting. All of them. Simultaneously." Victoria leaned forward, the platinum collar biting into her skin. "Simultaneously? A solar flare?" "No." Thomas looked down at the cracked screen of his datapad. He kept tapping the side of it with a fingernail. The small, rhythmic clicking sound gnawed at Victoria's nerves. Click, click, click. A flare would have a propagation delay. The buoys in the Oort cloud went dark at the exact same millisecond as the ones in the inner asteroid belt. It wasn't a wave. It was in blanket shutdown. "Humans," she muttered. The word tasted like ash. It had been 6 months since she ordered the pacification of the human mining colonies in the neighboring sector. The reports had made it sound so clinical. Asset denial, targeted kinetic strikes. The humans had been categorized as a fractured, disorganized species. Loud, certainly. Belligerent, yes. But they fought each other more than anyone else. The Imperial strategists had assured her that hitting their outer colonies would make them retreat, fold inward, and bicker over dwindling resources. Instead, they had gone completely silent. "Are they attempting an incursion?" Victoria asked. She tried to keep her hands still in her lap, but her left knee had developed a slight, involuntary tremor. She pressed her palm against her thigh to stop it. "We don't know," Thomas said, finally stopping the infernal tapping. He looked up, and for the first time, Victoria saw the whites of his eyes entirely surrounding his irises. He wasn't just concerned. He was terrified. The sensor grid is functioning perfectly, but it's returning garbage data. It's reporting mass shadows that defy physics. "Explain." "The orbital defense platform's gravity interferometers are screaming," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if he were afraid the empty hall was listening. "They are registering a mass accumulation just outside the atmosphere, but there's no optical data, no thermal bloom from engines, just gravity." Victoria stood up. The sudden movement made her lightheaded, a brief rush of vertigo that she blamed on the cold air and the heavy crown. She walked down the marble steps of the dais. Her boots clicked sharply against the floor. "You're telling me," she said, stopping a few feet from him, her voice low, "that there is something above my planet, pulling on it, and you can't see it?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Turn on the visual scopes, route them to the main display." Thomas hesitated. "The visual scopes are currently blinded by the sun's glare. They..." "Do it, Thomas." He bowed his head and tapped furiously on his datapad. The massive stained glass window behind the throne, a depiction of her ancestors conquering the stars, suddenly dissolved. The smart glass reconfigured, rendering a live, magnified feed of the low orbit above the capital. At first, it was just blue sky and the harsh, unfiltered light of their yellow sun. The high-altitude clouds drifted lazily, It looked peaceful, idyllic. Then, the air pressure in the throne room dropped. It wasn't a subtle shift. Victoria's ears popped violently. The heavy tapestries lining the walls sucked inward, clinging to the stone. A low-frequency hum, too deep to hear but intense enough to rattle the fillings in her teeth, resonated through the marble floor. "What is that?" she gasped, grabbing Thomas's shoulder to steady herself. His uniform fabric was damp. "Atmospheric displacement." Thomas choked out, staring at the screen. Something massive just displaced the exosphere. On the screen, the blue sky began to warp. The light bent, lensing as if looking through the bottom of a thick glass bottle. The humans hadn't crossed the distance using conventional drives. They hadn't braved the long dark. They had folded the space right on top of her homeworld, and they brought the dark with them. The first ship breached the visual threshold with the grace of a brick thrown through a window. It didn't glide out of slipspace. It tore its way in. A jagged, bleeding tear in the fabric of the sky ripped open, spitting out arcs of purple radiation that scorched the upper atmosphere. Out of that violent birth came a vessel so brutally ugly it made Victoria's stomach heave. It was a slab of utilitarian iron, squared off and blunt, built entirely around a central spinal cannon that ran the length of its chassis. There were no sweeping curves, no aesthetic flourishes. It was painted a dull, matte gray, scored and pitted with micrometeorite craters. Plumes of white gas vented aggressively from its flanks, making it look like a dying, heavy-breathing beast. It was massive, easily 30 kilometers long. Victoria stared at the monstrosity filling the screen. "One ship," she breathed. A sliver of hope, sharp and thin, pierced through her rising panic. "It's a dreadnought. A suicide run. Scramble the orbital guard. Focus all batteries on that." She didn't finish the sentence. The sky tore again, and again, and again. It sounded like a continuous crack of thunder that had no end. The smart glass window dimmed automatically to compensate for the blinding flashes of slipspace ruptures. But it wasn't enough. The sheer volume of energy being dumped into the planet's orbit was causing localized auroras, sickly green and violent magenta streaks tearing across the daytime sky. 2, 10, 50, 100. Victoria couldn't breathe. The platinum collar felt like a noose. She took a step backward, her boot catching the hem of her heavy ceremonial coat, and she stumbled. She didn't fall gracefully. She hit the cold marble on her hands and knees, the impact jarring her wrists. Thomas didn't help her up. He was paralyzed, his head thrown back, staring at the feed. 200, Thomas whispered. His voice was entirely hollowed out, a husk of a sound. 200 supercarriers, Mother of God. The sky was gone. The yellow sun had been blotted out. Above the capital city, a ceiling of pitted iron and glowing thruster banks had replaced the heavens. The shadows they cast were absolute. The temperature in the throne room plunged instantly as the artificial eclipse took hold. Victoria scrambled to her feet, her palms stinging, her royal dignity entirely forgotten. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wanted to scream. She wanted to order them destroyed. But the words withered in her dry throat. The physical reality of what she was looking at short-circuited her brain. The Imperial Fleet's largest vessel, her personal flagship, was barely 4 kilometers long. It was a masterpiece of engineering. These human ships were crude, industrial nightmares, each one large enough to possess its own gravitational pull. They have gravity. The thought slammed into her just as the alarms finally began to shriek. They weren't the standard military klaxons. They were the civil defense sirens, the wailing, mournful pitch meant to warn of natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis. "The tides," Victoria croaked, staring at Thomas. "The localized gravity of 200 vessels of that mass." Thomas was frantically swiping at his pad, his shaking fingers missing the icons. "They are in low orbit. Too low. The tidal shear. The oceans are already bulging. Coastal cities are reporting immediate flooding. The tectonic strain on the capital's fault line." The ground shuddered. Dust rained down from the vaulted ceiling, settling in a fine gray layer over Victoria's dark coat and the velvet of the empty throne. They hadn't fired a single shot. They hadn't dropped a single bomb. Their mere presence was cracking the planet open. Victoria tasted copper. She had bitten the inside of her cheek hard enough to draw blood. The sharp pain was the only thing anchoring her to reality. She forced herself to look away from the apocalyptic display on the glass and grabbed Thomas by the lapels of his uniform. "The defense grid," she snarled, spittle flying from her lips. "Fire the grid, the planetary railguns." Thomas looked at her. His eyes were utterly defeated. "Your Grace, we did." Victoria froze. "What?" The automated defense grid engaged the moment they dropped out of slip space. 40 heavy kinetic slugs were fired. And nothing, Thomas said, a hysterical, breathless laugh bubbling up from his chest. The lead human ship didn't even activate a shielding matrix. It just took the hits. They hit its frontal armor and shattered. It didn't even budge its orbital trajectory. Victoria let go of his uniform. She backed away, her hands trembling. The Imperial war machine, the untouchable might that had crushed a dozen systems, had just bounced off a human ship's bumper. She looked back at the screen. The 200 carriers just hung there in the darkness they had created. They were perfectly stationary. The silence from them was deafening. It was worse than an immediate bombardment. It was a calculated, psychological, crushing weight. They were letting her look at them. They were letting the planet feel the physical consequence of their mass. They wanted her to know exactly what was about to happen. 5 agonizing minutes passed. The palace was vibrating continuously. Somewhere in the distance, a loud, structural groan echoed through the corridors, followed by the crash of collapsing masonry. The planet was buckling under the gravitational stress. Victoria sat on the bottom step of the dais, her knees pulled together, her arms wrapped around herself. The cold was biting into her bones. Her mind raced through diplomatic protocols, conditional surrenders, tactical retreats. Every scenario ended in the same gray, suffocating iron sky. "They are broadcasting," Thomas suddenly announced. He was crouched by a tactical console near the entrance, holding an earpiece against his head. Victoria snapped her head up. "On what frequency?" "All of them," Thomas said. "Military, civilian, emergency, unencrypted radio, even the automated logistics bands. It's a blanket override. Put it through the main hall speakers. Audio and visual." Victoria stood, smoothing her coat, desperately trying to assemble the shattered pieces of her regal facade. She wiped the dust from her cheeks and locked her jaw. If she was going to face the architects of her empire's destruction, she would do it standing. The large, smart glass window flickered. The image of the eclipsed sky was replaced by the interior of a ship. Victoria braced herself for a warlord. She expected a commander, clad in heavy armor, surrounded by weapons, barking demands for blood and territory. She expected triumph, rage, or cold sadism. Instead, the screen resolved into a cramped, aggressively bright room. The bulkheads were painted a sterile, peeling off-white. Bundles of exposed cabling ran along the ceiling, held together by cheap nylon ties. Sitting behind a battered metal desk was a human male. He wore a slightly wrinkled, dark blue uniform shirt, with the sleeves rolled up past his elbows. He looked to be in his late 50s, with thinning gray hair and dark, heavy bags under his eyes. He wasn't glaring at the camera. In fact, he wasn't looking at it at all. He was looking down at a stack of flimsy paper documents, a stylus tucked behind one ear. In his right hand, he held a flimsy, white foam cup. As the feed established itself, he brought the cup to his lips and took a slow sip, wincing slightly as if the liquid inside was too hot or tasted terrible. He set the cup down. He sighed. It was a heavy, exhausted sound that crackled through the throne room speakers. Finally, he looked up into the camera. "I am Commander Hayes, 5th Fleet Logistics and Pacification," he said. His voice wasn't booming. It was rough, monotone, and entirely devoid of passion. He sounded like a man who had been working a 16-hour shift and just wanted to go to sleep. Victoria stared. "Logistics and pacification?" Am I speaking to the sovereign authority of this system? Hayes asked, shuffling the papers on his desk. I am Empress Victoria, she said, projecting her voice to be picked up by the room's ambient mics. Ruler of the... Right. Yes, Empress Victoria, Hayes interrupted, looking down at his paper. He didn't seem impressed. He didn't even seem angry. He just seemed bored. I'm going to make this very brief, ma'am, because maintaining this orbital hold is burning through my fuel reserves, and the paperwork for a resupply is a nightmare. Victoria felt a flush of pure, indignant rage hot wire her nervous system. She was facing the end of her world, and this man was complaining about paperwork? You violate sovereign space, Victoria snapped, her voice trembling with fury. You park 200 dreadnoughts above my capital, destabilizing my planet's crust, and you speak to me of fuel reserves? Do you know what I can? Stop, Hayes said. He didn't raise his voice, but the absolute flatness of the command cut her off like a physical blow. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the metal desk, interlacing his fingers. The exhaustion in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, dead stare that made the hair on Victoria's arms stand up. You don't get to posture, Hayes said quietly. 6 months ago, you ordered the orbital bombardment of 3 human mining colonies in the Sigma cluster. You killed 84,000 civilians. You did it because you wanted the titanium deposits, and you thought we were too fractured to organize a response. Victoria swallowed hard. They were illegal settlements and contested. It took us 3 months to stop fighting each other, Hayes continued, ignoring her completely. It took us another 2 months to refit the industrial haulers into the ships you see above you. We bolted magnetic accelerators onto cargo spines and strapped armor plating over the crew quarters. What you are looking at, Empress, isn't the human military. Hayes picked up his foam cup, swirled the dregs, and set it back down. This is the Miners' Guild, and we are very upset. The silence in the throne room was absolute. The low rumble of the planet groaning beneath their feet was the only sound, not the military. Victoria's mind blanked. The 200 massive, ugly, indestructible slabs of iron blocking out the sun were repurposed cargo ships. Here is the situation, Hayes said, picking up a single sheet of paper. He began to read from it in a bored, bureaucratic drone. You have exactly 20 Earth minutes to unconditionally surrender. This includes the complete disarmament of all orbital and planetary defense systems, the grounding of all Imperial vessels, and your personal surrender to our custody. And if I refuse? Victoria whispered. The defiance was gone. She just needed to know the parameters of her doom. Hayes looked at her. He didn't smile. He didn't sneer. If you refuse, we don't bombard you, Hayes said simply. We just turn our main thrusters toward the surface and burn for 10 minutes. The exhaust wash will strip your atmosphere away. Then, we lock tractor beams onto your moon, and we drag it into your capital. He checked a cheap analog watch on his wrist. You have 19 minutes, Empress. Please don't make me fill out the planetary destruction forms. They are in triplicate. The screen went black. The smart glass reset to the live feed of the sky. The 200 massive brutalist ships hung in the darkness, unmoving. Victoria stood in the center of her crumbling throne room. The smell of ozone and burnt copper was overwhelming. She looked at Thomas. The old general was weeping silently, tears cutting clean lines through the gray dust coating his face. She reached up, her fingers trembling, and fumbled with the clasp of the spun platinum collar. It was stiff, stubborn. With a sudden, desperate yank, she tore it free, scraping the skin off her collarbone in the process. It hit the marble floor with a heavy, hollow clatter. Thomas, she said, her voice small, raw, and completely human. Yes, Your Grace? Call them back. Give them whatever they want. The human landing craft did not glide. It fell. It dropped through the atmosphere like a thrown anvil, its retro rockets only kicking in at the final, agonizing second. The concussive blast of the landing thrusters hit the royal courtyard with the force of a localized hurricane, shattering the frosted glass of the winter conservatory and uprooting a row of 300-year-old cycad trees. Empress Victoria stood on the grand balcony, shivering. She had refused a thicker coat. The temperature had plummeted 20 degrees since the human fleet blotted out the sun, plunging the capital into an artificial, freezing twilight. The air smelled foul. It was a suffocating cocktail of unburned kerosene, heated ceramite, and the sharp, acidic tang of pulverized marble. Below her, the landing craft sat in the center of the crushed courtyard. It was a blocky, utilitarian wedge of scarred metal, leaking a viscous brown fluid onto the fractured paving stones. The deployment ramp descended with a shrieking, pneumatic whine that made Victoria's teeth ache. She expected a legion of conquerors. She expected power armor, plasma rifles, and the polished discipline of a superior military force. Instead, a dozen humans trudged down the ramp. They wore bulky, stained environment suits in faded shades of industrial orange and yellow. Heavy utility belts sagged around their waists, loaded with tools, scanners, and sidearms that looked terrifyingly primitive heavy. Square blocks of blued steel. They didn't march. They walked with the slow, deliberate exhaustion of people who were already 10 hours into a double shift. One of them, a tall woman with her hair pulled back into a messy, grease-stained knot, stopped at the base of a shattered cycad tree. She pulled a bulky scanner from her hip, pointed it at the palace wall, and swore loudly in a harsh, guttural language. "Thomas," Victoria said. Her voice was thin, brittle. "Go down there. Bring their commander to the map room. Your Grace. Protocol demands." "There is no protocol, Thomas," she snapped, a sudden flare of panic cutting through her carefully maintained numbness. "Look at the sky. Look at our walls. Just go." 30 minutes later, Victoria sat at the head of the obsidian table in the map room. The heavy wooden doors opened, and Thomas walked in, looking pale and deeply uncomfortable. Behind him walked Commander Hayes. Up close, the human looked even more ordinary, and somehow entirely more terrifying. He wore a high-visibility vest over his dark blue uniform shirt. The vest was smeared with black grease. He smelled intensely of stale coffee, ozone, and sour sweat. He carried a battered, metal-bound ledger under one arm. He didn't bow. He didn't offer a salute. He simply walked to the opposite end of the obsidian table, pulled out a heavily carved mahogany chair with the toe of his heavy steel-toed boot, and sat down with a heavy sigh. He dropped the metal ledger onto the table. It landed with a loud, final thud. "You have a structural microfracture running down the entire west wing of this building," Hayes said, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his hand. His fingernails were rimmed with dirt. "The tidal stress from the fleet is pulling your tectonic plates apart. If we stay in orbit for another 48 hours, your capital city is going to slide into the ocean." Victoria folded her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. "Then I suggest you leave, Commander. I have issued the surrender. My planetary defense network is offline. My fleets are powered down. You have your victory. Claim your territory and withdraw your ships." Hayes lowered his hand and stared at her. The exhausted, bored demeanor vanished, replaced by that same cold, dead-eyed stare he had given her through the broadcast. "You still don't get it," he said softly. He opened the ledger. The pages were real paper, thin and covered in dense, microscopic spreadsheets. He flipped through them, tracing a line with a cheap plastic pen. "We aren't a government, Empress," Hayes said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "We don't want your territory. We don't want to rule your people. We are the United Interstellar Mining Guild. You aren't being conquered." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "You are being audited." Victoria felt a cold knot form in the pit of her stomach. "I don't understand." 6 months ago, Hayes said, tapping the plastic pen against the ledger. Tap, tap, tap. "You dropped kinetic kill vehicles on the Sigma cluster. 3 mining colonies. 84,212 registered guild members died. You vaporized 3 deep core processors, 200 atmospheric harvesters, and a fleet of automated barges." "It was contested space," Victoria whispered, the words sounding hollow even to her. "It was a work site," Hayes corrected harshly. "And you destroyed it. Now, if you had hit the military, they would have come here, bombed your cities, planted a flag, and called it a day. But you hit the guild. You hit our union. Hayes turned the ledger around and pushed it across the polished obsidian table. It slid until it bumped against Victoria's folded hands. "What is this?" she asked, looking down at the columns of numbers. "That," Hayes said, leaning back in his chair, "is a bill." Victoria stared at the bottom line. The number was incomprehensible. It was a figure with so many zeros it blurred in her vision. It wasn't just greater than the treasury of the capital. It was greater than the gross domestic product of her entire solar system for the last 3 centuries. 84,000 death benefits, paid out at triple rate for hostile workplace environments, Hayes listed, ticking the items off on his fingers. Replacement costs for 3 deep-core processors, adjusted for inflation, hazard pay for the 200 crews currently holding orbit above your head, fuel costs, late fees, administrative processing. "This is absurd," Victoria breathed, her shock temporarily overriding her fear. "There isn't enough currency in the entire empire to pay this. This is a joke, a sick, psychological game." "We don't do jokes in accounting," Hayes said flatly. "And we don't want your currency. Your imperial credit is fiat money backed by a military that currently doesn't exist. It's worthless to us." "Then what do you want?" she yelled, her composure shattering. She slammed her hand onto the table. "You come here, you blot out my sun, you crack my planet, and you hand me a piece of paper. What do you want from me? Blood? Take it. Execute me, and be done with it." Hayes sighed. He looked genuinely annoyed. "Executions don't balance the books, Victoria," he said. He didn't use her title. The omission felt like a slap. "Blood doesn't buy titanium. We are here to repossess." He signaled to the door. 2 more humans walked in. One was a burly man, carrying a stack of fluorescent orange stickers. The other was the woman from the courtyard, holding her scanner. "Miller, Campbell," Hayes said, gesturing vaguely around the opulent map room. "Start the inventory. Everything goes. The gold thread in the tapestries, the raw metals in the structural supports, the servers in the basement. Tag it all." "Copy that, boss." "The man," Campbell muttered. He peeled an orange sticker from his roll, walked over to a priceless, ancient Ming-equivalent vase sitting on a pedestal, and slapped the bright orange adhesive directly onto the painted ceramic. He scanned it, muttered a number into his headset, and moved on. Victoria watched in mounting horror. They weren't desecrating her history out of malice. They were doing it with absolute, suffocating indifference. They were treating a 3,000-year-old dynasty like a bankrupt diner. "Your military vessels are currently being boarded," Hayes continued, ignoring the beeping of Campbell's scanner. "They are being stripped of their engines, their weapon systems, and their navigation cores. The hulls will be melted down for scrap. Your orbital defense grid is being disassembled as we speak. We are taking the wiring." "You are dismantling my empire," Victoria whispered, her throat tight. "We are liquidating your assets to cover your debt," Hayes corrected. "By my calculations, stripping the military and seizing all royal properties covers about 14% of the principal balance." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Which brings us to the remaining 86%. And that, Victoria, brings us to you." The silence in the map room was absolute, broken only by the sharp, electronic beep of Campbell's scanner and the rustle of Thomas shifting his weight near the heavy oak doors. The air had grown noticeably thinner, carrying a faint, chemical odor, now the sharp, synthetic tang of the industrial adhesive on the backs of the fluorescent orange inventory tags. Victoria watched, entirely paralyzed, as Campbell walked over to a towering, oil-painted portrait of her great-grandfather, Emperor William the Unifier. The man had conquered 3 star systems with fire and sword. Campbell didn't even look at the face. He just slapped a bright orange sticker directly onto William's painted armor, scanned it, muttered a string of alphanumeric digits into his headset, and moved on to the silver candelabras. It was the most violent act of desecration she had ever witnessed, made infinitely worse by how utterly boring it was to the man performing it. Victoria dragged her eyes back to Commander Hayes. The crushing pressure in her chest made it difficult to draw a full breath. The cold from the obsidian table was seeping through the fabric of her trousers, chilling her skin. "What about me?" she asked. Her voice cracked, betraying the raw, frantic terror she was trying to swallow down. "You are the CEO of this failing enterprise," Hayes said. He reached into the inner pocket of his grease-stained high-visibility vest. He pulled out a thick stack of stapled, slightly crumpled paperwork and tossed it onto the open ledger. It smelled faintly of cheap toner and stale tobacco. "You authorized the kinetic strike. The liability ultimately rests on your shoulders. You owe the guild." "I have nothing left," Victoria said, spreading her hands wide. "You are taking my ships. You are taking my palace, my medals, my history. What else can you possibly take?" "Your time," Hayes said simply. He dug a cheap, clear plastic ballpoint pen out of his shirt pocket and tossed it onto the paperwork in front of her. It rolled and came to a stop against her thumb. "The guild doesn't believe in execution," Hayes continued, his voice dropping into a relentless, monotonous drone. "And we don't believe in prison. Prisons cost money to build, they cost money to heat, and they generate zero revenue. We believe in restitution. We are currently setting up a planetary salvage and extraction operation. We need to strip mine the unpopulated gas giants in your outer system to make up the rest of the deficit. That requires localized administration, supply chain routing, and a massive amount of paperwork." He pointed a blunt, calloused finger at the stapled documents. "That is a contract of indentured servitude. You are going to sign it. You are going to step down from whatever it is you call this throne of yours. You are going to put on a high-vis jacket. You are going to sit in a prefabricated aluminum cubicle, and you are going to manage the fuel lines for our deep-core mining barges. You will work a standard 14-hour shift, 6 days a week. You get 2 15-minute breaks and 30 minutes for lunch." Victoria stared at the white pages. The words printed there were small, dense, and entirely devoid of emotion. Her mind simply couldn't process the sheer, mundane horror of the proposal. If they had dragged her into the courtyard and lined her up against the palace wall, she could have died a martyr. She could have died an empress, defiant to the last, looking her executioner in the eye. Her name would be whispered in the dark corners of the galaxy for 1,000 years. She would be a tragic victim of barbarian conquerors, a symbol of lost grace. But this? There was no glory in this. There were no epic ballads written about a deposed monarch managing fuel logistics in a windowless, humming trailer. They were deliberately stripping her of her mythology. They were turning her into a clerk. It wasn't a punishment. It was a demotion. "I am royalty," she breathed, a desperate, final attempt to cling to the crumbling walls of her identity. She pushed the paperwork away an inch. "My bloodline has ruled this sector for 3 millennia. I will not be a tallyman for a pack of grave robbers. Execute me. Have your men shoot me where I sit and be done with it." Hayes didn't get angry. He didn't yell. He just looked deeply, profoundly tired. He pinched the bridge of his nose, closing his eyes for a long moment before looking back at her. "If I shoot you, Victoria, I have to fill out a lethal incident report," Hayes said, his tone perfectly level. "I have to secure a biological waste disposal unit. I have to wait for a guild coroner to fly out here and certify the corpse. That takes 3 weeks. And at the end of it, I still have an 86% deficit on the ledger, and I'm down a pair of hands that could be organizing cargo manifests." He leaned over the table, bringing his face closer to hers. He smelled of bitter coffee and old sweat. "Your bloodline just went bankrupt," Hayes said, his voice dropping into a tone of absolute chilling authority that pinned her to the chair. "Your legacy isn't an empire anymore. It's a localized debt bubble. You are a debtor. You are a biological asset. Nothing more." He tapped the cheap analog watch on his wrist. "I need to cycle the main thrusters on the fleet in 8 minutes to keep our orbit stable over your capital. Every time I do that, the localized gravity well opens up another fault line under this city. I've already dropped 3 of your coastal districts into the sea. Sign the paperwork, Victoria. Or we leave, we cut our losses, and we let the raw mass of our ships pull your atmosphere into the vacuum." Victoria looked down at the pen. The plastic casing was slightly gnawed at the end. Someone had chewed on it while thinking. It was such a small, insignificant, terribly human detail, and it made her want to vomit. She looked over her shoulder at Thomas, the old general, the man who had taught her military strategy, the man who had sworn an oath to die for her, wasn't looking at her. He was watching Campbell methodically stick a bright orange tag on a priceless ceremonial sword mounted on the wall. The Empire wasn't dying in a blaze of glory. It was being catalogued, packed into crates, and shipped away to pay for titanium. Her hands shook violently as she picked up the pen. The cheap plastic felt practically weightless in her fingers, utterly lacking the heavy, solemn gravity of the royal seal she used to authorize the kinetic strikes 6 months ago. She turned to the last page of the contract. There were dotted lines for signatures, dates, and alphanumeric identification numbers. At the bottom, printed in small, precise, human text, it read, "I acknowledge my outstanding debt to the United Interstellar Mining Guild and accept the terms of restitution until the principal balance is resolved." She pressed the ballpoint to the paper. Her signature, usually a sweeping, aggressive display of elegant calligraphy that spanned half a page, came out jerky, small, and cramped. It looked like the scratchings of a terrified animal. She pushed the paper back across the obsidian table. Hayes picked it up. He briefly checked the signature line, nodded once, and tucked the contract into his vest pocket. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. "Welcome to the Guild. Employee 84213, Hayes said. He stood up, grabbing the heavy metal ledger off the table. "Campbell, Miller," Hayes called out, turning his back on her. "Wrap it up. Tag the obsidian table, too. I know a guy on Ceres who pays top credit for uncut volcanic glass. We have a lot of scrap to move before the end of the quarter." Hayes walked out of the map room, his heavy steel-toed boots echoing sharply against the floor, leaving a trail of black engine grease and gray dust on the pristine marble. Victoria remained seated at the table, now bearing a bright orange sticker near the corner. The biting cold from the artificial eclipse outside seemed to seep straight through the palace walls, settling deep into the marrow of her bones. She reached up with a trembling hand, her fingers ghosting over the spot on her collarbone where the heavy platinum ring of her crown used to sit. The skin was raw and abraded, stinging slightly in the frigid air. Through the shattered glass of the winter conservatory, the sky remained pitch black, completely choked by the impenetrable iron bellies of the human supercarriers. The low, structural hum of their massive gravity generators vibrated through the floorboards and up through the soles of her boots, a constant, rhythmic, mechanical reminder that the old gods of the galaxy had been permanently replaced by the relentless accountants of the new. She looked down at her hands resting on her lap. They were no longer the hands of an empress, holding the power of life and death over billions. They were just the hands of a logistics manager, waiting in the dark for her shift to begin. If you loved the cold, hard karma and the sheer bureaucratic weight of this extended HFY story, hit that like button to support the channel. Sometimes, the most devastating vengeance isn't a laser blast, but a clipboard, a cheap pen, and a massive debt. How would you handle being audited by an entire fleet of angry human miners? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans and subscribe for more deep, grounded stories.